Welcome everyone to our virtual forum number 29. This is ARCI's regular virtual forum meeting, and it's the 16th of March, 2024. I'm Tom Zaczek, your moderator for today. Matt Pollock is behind the curtain, pulling the strings and recording and doing all the Zoom tricks to keep this running smoothly. Today we've got a great agenda in front of us here. We've got two awesome presentations lined up, and then we have our typical show and tell techniques. And then after that, we do date on our next swap meet, and then Tom Kleinschmidt will do a special presentation on RadioFest coming up in August. After all that, we have a session where we talk about items wanted, items for sale, and an open session for chatting amongst ourselves if we have the time. So with that being said, I will stop sharing and introduce our first presenter, Tom Perera, who's going to do a rather lengthy presentation on counterfeit radios from Phil Weingarten's Fabulous Fakes. Tom has recently joined the virtual forum and did a short show and tell about Phil. And Tom now is going to do his full-length version of this presentation. And Tom is an awesome presenter and has great credentials. He's an expert on Enigma machines, and he's a retired neuroscience professor. So he's a very interesting man. And with that, I will turn it over to Tom.
Welcome, everybody. We're going to be following the career of the most infamous counterfeiter in radio, telegraph keys, and antique tubes, and that is Phil Weingarten. Phil was born in 1914 and died in the 60s, and we're going to see some of his work. I'll start out by telling you about the beginnings. I get this thing working. This is a picture taken of a bunch of World War I radio operators in training. And the pink arrow way in the back is Phil's dad. So he evolved and developed his radio interest following his dad's work on radios in World War I. His dad then knew about radios. You can see a great big spark transmitter and receiver system in front of the class, and all the cadets sort of learning about it. So that's how he got his start. And then he followed up by his own education, took many courses in radio theory. And this was all the time as he was growing up. Something called Radio Row was in effect in New York City. Radio Row was a wonderful area of New York City in which a great many radio shops clustered together. And these shops sold radios at very reasonable prices, but they also sold parts, and they also fixed radios. And this is a little pile of radios. If they couldn't fix a radio, they would put it out on the street. And you can see this is 25 cents per radio. This was my favorite store at that point. I would go there at exactly 4 o'clock in the afternoon when the guy would put out these radios, and I would talk him into the possibility of giving me some of those radios because I was just a kid. And so I ended up with dozens of these radio sets basically for free. And I had no clue what radios were doing, how they worked or anything. So I just took them apart, and I made, this was the beginning of my junk box. All of us have junk boxes, and this was definitely the beginning of mine. I started building a huge collection of 632 screws. And I think that's sort of the badge of courage for all of us collectors. If we have 632 screws in many more than we could ever use in a lifetime. It was fun to take apart these radios and look at the construction of them and figure out what they might be doing, but I really didn't understand it at all. And I had a guy who was interested in me, and so I got him to give me radios, and he eventually told me, why don't you go out and build a radio kit and so on. But this is the time when Phil was growing up, was setting up his shop, and he had a shop in Radio Row on Canal Street. And you walk down a bunch of stairs into a little shop, and the shop was completely filled with radio equipment and parts. And there were big tables out there, and you could just walk among the tables and pick out parts. So that was how he was making money at that point. And the other shops in Radio Row were great. You could buy parts. So it was sort of competition between Phil's shop and these other shops for who could attract the most people to their place. There's a picture of Phil Weingarten, and he had built a huge collection of parts in his house in Queens in New York. And there's a picture, he's smiling there. And here is his first workbench, test equipment, some of it military surplus equipment. And he learned radio servicing, and he started to figure out how to build radios. And here he is with some of his collection. He started collecting radios. You could buy radios very, very cheaply in those days, even the very, very fancy radios. And so he built a huge collection. And by 1968, let's say he started in the 1940s, but by 1968, he had a huge collection of radio equipment, which he called various things. The Forest Hills Radio Museum, the Marconi Museum, we'll see that in a moment, but he started filling shelves with these radios. And these were all original radios that he was collecting initially. Here is some of his stationery, the Forest Hills Wireless Museum, the Marconi Museum of Wireless Telegraphy, military affiliate radio station system, and radio repair laboratories in which he will repair vacuum tubes of all things. So he had all this paperwork, and it all led back to him. The Antique Wireless Association made him a member. You can see this is his membership in the Antique Wireless Association. The Antique Wireless Association eventually kicked him out. We'll see that in a moment or so. I'm just going to take you on a little tour of his radio museum in his house in Queens. And these radios are absolutely extraordinary and exceptionally picked, the very best of the best radios. And he had access to these things through Radio Row. People would bring these things in and say, I want a modern radio. And they'd hand over one of these things to the shops in Radio Row and say, I want to get rid of this old thing. I want a modern radio. So he had picked up a huge number of very, very important antique radios through that process. Here's another picture of his collection, and still another picture of his collection. These were taken by Anders Wedell in about 1968 or thereabout. Here are some more of the radios in his collection, more, and still more. I don't recognize this, but it looks like it might be a transmitting system. And anybody recognize that guy? Okay, just one of the things in his collection. Here's a transmitting part of the rooms in which his collection were located. You can see a whole bunch of familiar stuff there, the Marconi in the front, and more interesting little typewriter that you see in the lower part of this picture. It is a typewriter that actually sends Morse code. So all of the keys, instead of typing, they move a little Morse code sounder that you see in the top. top and make the appropriate Morse code characters. Very unusual device. He liked telegraph keys. He knew that he could make money by selling telegraph keys. So he decided he'd load in a great many telegraph keys. They're fairly easy to transport. So many of the items in his shop on Canal Street were telegraph keys looking like this. And he also loved tubes. So he had access to just an incredible number of very, very rare and interesting tubes because of Radio Row. And this is just part of his tube collection, some more of his tubes. And here's a picture of Phil Weingarten on the right and Joel Kossoff on the left. Joel's a member of the AWA, and Phil liked younger people. He felt he was a good teacher, and he decided he would start teaching Joel about radio. So he took Joel through his collection and showed some of this stuff to Joel, and Joel was pretty impressed, as I think anyone would be seeing a collection like that. We'll start out with Phil's counterfeit telegraph keys. He discovered that telegraph keys could be sold for a great deal of money. And so what he decided to do was to make counterfeit telegraph keys. And this is one of his most infamous counterfeit telegraph keys. It's a Massey spark key used to key a World War I spark transmitter, coastal spark transmitter. And the one we're seeing in this picture is a fake. And Phil made that fake in order to sell it. And he ended up with a number of these, and he sold them for very high prices. $7,000 was the typical price for a Massey telegraph key like this. The telegraph keys were actually made for him. Phil didn't do the actual machining of the telegraph keys. They were machined by Hugo Pisciani. And Hugo was interviewed a little while ago by some club members, and he was willing to say how many of these keys he made for Phil. And he made 6 of those Massey telegraph keys, 20 of the Marconi telegraph keys that we'll see in a moment, and 6 Marconi grasshopper keys. So Hugo built these things. And in the interview, when he was asked if he knew about Phil's selling these keys as original, he was quoted as saying, "I don't know nothing about that stuff." So we don't know whether he really knew that these were fakes or whether he didn't want to say or whatever. Anyway, that's the machinist who was making these keys. And this is his machine shop. You can see it's a very elaborate and extraordinarily complete machine shop again in Brooklyn, Queens. This is an original Massey spark key in use by Bob Merriam, the founder and director of the New England Museum of Wireless and Steam, and a picture of him before he passed away using his Massey key. And this is a fake Massey key, as we've seen. I was given this key by a customer of Phil's who was extremely angry about what Phil had done in making this key. So when this customer found out that it was a fake, he came to me and he said, "I got to get rid of this thing. Just take it away. I'm so embarrassed." So I figured I'd keep it in my collection. And it's very well done. But the problem is Phil didn't make his labels quite right. And so if you look at the real Massey telegraph key label in the upper part of this picture, and you compare it to Phil's cast Massey telegraph key label in the bottom part of the picture, you can see that it just isn't quite right. Phil never was able to make a really good sand casting of the original key. So that's one of the 2 ways of telling a fake Massey key from a real one, the label. And the second way is to look at the screw that holds the handle into the lever of the key. And it is, in this case, a 1/4 20 cadmium plated screw, and the original had a brass screw. So there are just two ways. Otherwise, the thing looks very, very realistic. Phil made another fake of the Marconi telegraph key. Marconi telegraph keys were thought to be quite collectible. And this is an original Marconi telegraph key. You can see by the label on the left. And here's a comparison of the original telegraph key and the Phil Weingarten telegraph key. And as you can see, there's very little difference here, except if you look very closely at the label. And here we see a comparison of the label of the real telegraph key, the real Marconi telegraph key, spark key on the top, and Phil's version of the label on the bottom. And you can see it was made with one of those pantograph devices and a Dremel tool where the letters were etched out, and it just isn't quite right. So that's again a way of telling the real key from the fake key. Phil wanted to make more money on these keys, so he would fake an entire gift, a telegraph key dedicated to somebody. And this is a telegraph key that was dedicated to Ludwig Arnson, and supposedly given to him by the associates in Radio Receptor Corporation. And Phil sold this to a friend of mine, I guess it was maybe 20 years, 30 years ago. Must have been more than that. Anyway, he ended up with this thing, and it was only fairly recently that he found out that it was a fake, and he was not very happy about that. Joel Kossoff, by the way, reported that when he visited Phil, Phil showed him his way of dealing with customers who were not happy when they discovered that he had made fakes. And that is, Joel said that Phil Weingarten kept a loaded German 9mm Luger pistol under the seat in his sofa in his living room, just in case somebody came to threaten his life. I don't know whether he ever used it or showed it to people, but you don't want to go and went back to Phil and challenge him, I guess. This is a very funny telegraph key, I think, that Phil sold as an original telegraph key. He called it an airplane hand key, SE59. There's no such thing as an airplane hand key, SE59. What Phil had done was to put this relatively common key in a special base and then engraved the base. And you can see that his spelling wasn't very good here. And when he engraved the word Signal Corps U.S. Army, he misspelled the word signal. So that's certainly one way of telling that it was not an appropriate or real key. That key that you're looking at actually came from the relatively common service buzzer Signal Corps U.S. Army trench set. And this was just a field telegraph set that was designed for use in the field and in mud in the trenches. And that little area on the right there is the top of the telegraph key, but it's sealed with leather so that it does the key system doesn't get covered with mud in the trenches. Here's a field telegraph set open, and you can see that Phil had simply taken that little key that you see on the right out, cut down the base of the key, and then built a base to sit it on. And he would sell those things for about $900 because they're aircraft telegraph keys. And in actuality, they cost him about maybe $20 to buy one of these sets in those days. And then he took over. Here's another very, very funny Phil Weingarten modification of a telegraph key. This is a Japanese-made swallow bug. And Phil has simply engraved on the side of this Japanese key, the Marconi International Marine Communication Company Limited in London. So I took this Japanese key and made it into a Marconi key, and he would then sell those for $500 to $700 as rare Marconi bugs. Marconi never made a bug. Anyway, we move on to some of Phil's radios, and Phil made some extremely impressive radios. The DeForest RJ9 is a dream for a collector. If you find one of these, you're so happy. And the problem is that a lot of them are Phil Weingarten fakes. And how do you tell when it's a Phil Weingarten fake? It's very, very difficult. But let's focus on the label that we see here, the DeForest Audion label, and look really closely at it. And it looks totally appropriate. And the giveaway is the fact that if you go and visit Phil, he has dozens of these labels that he's made that he just puts on his constructed radios. So the ability to tell this radio as a Phil Weingarten replica is very limited, very difficult to do that. And it's unfortunate because people are paying immense amounts of money for this radio with no clear certainty that it isn't a Phil Weingarten replica. Here are some more DeForest tags from radios. What Phil did sometimes is he would borrow a radio from a collector and say he just wanted to study the circuit. He was trying to fix one or something like that. The collector would loan him this radio, and Phil would quietly slip one of his fake tags onto the radio and keep the original radio label or tag for himself, and so that he could try to make a really good replica of it. Very, very nasty of him. And I know of at least one person who did that. Phil got this guy to send him a radio all the way from Australia. And when he sent it back, it didn't have the right labels on it. And of course, Phil knew that the Australian guy was never going to come and get him or complain. So he didn't hesitate to steal the label and replace it with one of his. Here's another radio set. We were talking about this a little while ago, and it is extremely difficult to tell whether this is a Phil Weingarten or an original. Again, I typically turn to the label as the primary indicator. But in order to tell that that label is inappropriate, you'd have to have a real label to compare it with. And not many people have a real label to compare it with. I'm hoping that maybe at some point somebody could put together a book, an archive, a set of pictures, something that people could use to help them discriminate between fakes and the real thing. To my way of thinking, this is the giveaway. Phil had a chemical that he would put on labels to make them look old. And I remember going down to Canal Street, and Phil told me to go around the corner to a store, and that's the place to go for this chemical. And he said, I use lots of it. And the chemical would make anything look aged. And they had different concoctions for making brass labels look aged and other metals to look aged. And this is a classic Phil Weingarten Phil aged label. And I think that it's fairly obvious that that was hooked up and fake, but you have to look at it closely. I think perhaps also the two screws are a giveaway. I would probably expect to see brass screws rather than cadmium plated screws there, but that's about all I know that can help you discriminate between this and the real thing. Phil, when he died, people went into his house and just found the most incredible piles of labels and printouts of labels that he used to send off to companies. There are not a lot of companies out there that'll make labels if you send them a design. And that's one of the things that Phil did. He had these labels made for him. If it was engraving, such as we saw on his telegraph keys, Hugo would do that. But for a complete label, he would usually send off a drawing and get them to send him 20 or 30 of those. Phil also had Atwater Kent warranty cards in his home, and he would just stick one of these fake cards into every Atwater Kent radio that he built, and it added some degree of validity to the radio. The problem was that for some reason he stamped all of the labels with the same date, and that's one of the tip-offs, I guess. The Super DX8 Lutz radio may have been built by Phil Weingarten. I don't know for sure, but the suspicious part is that it was the label says that it was made in Long Island City, where Phil was. And maybe Robert Lozier would be able to tell us whether he had ever come across any Phil Weingarten versions of this radio, or maybe some of you can do that. I would be very suspicious about anything that had Brooklyn or Long Island City on its label, but I don't know enough about how to tell different. This is the inside of the Lutz radio. I think that Phil just made up that name and made up these radios and sold them, but I don't know. The AWA became very concerned when people started having problems with Phil, and published numerous notices saying that a notorious person who lives in the New York City area uses different names and addresses. And several members have been taken by this shady character. He is no longer an AWA member, although he appears to have access to the AWA bulletin want ads. So AWA was very worried about him and eventually kicked him out. And he keeps changing his name and location: Forest Hills, Rego Park, New York, but always the same zip code, 11374. So I guess that's one of the ways. If you see a zip code on the radios, I don't think they had zip codes back in the days of those earlier radios. Then move on to look at some of Phil's counterfeit radio tubes. He decided he's doing so well with the radios, why not counterfeit the tubes? And so he decided to blow his own tubes. And he started making very good, fully working counterfeit tubes. And again, it's very difficult to tell that from the real thing. This is his first tube blowing setup in his house. And he started out by making a very simple tube. You can make it out of glass tubing called a Marconi coherer. And this is a Phil Weingarten version of the Marconi coherer. You can see that it's quite well made. Let's compare it with an original one. This is the Weingarten version again, and this is the actual glass of the coherer. And again, the lettering on the ivory rod there was made by Hugo's engraving machine, and it says MWT Company Limited at Marconi Wireless Telegraph Company Limited. So typical Phil Weingarten. And just look back at those. The difference between the real thing and the original is very hard to tell. The wrapping, Phil used about the same wrapping. The wire used the same color wires. Very difficult to tell that. Anyway, here's a picture of his tube blowing shop. He bought a lot more equipment and started blowing more and more of these tubes and making them and selling them. He sold them for a great deal of money. The deforest audions he would certainly get about $1,000 for, and he just blew them in his workshop there. And these are some of the devices that you use when you're blowing tubes. This is called a crossfire, and I guess it's a bunch of burners that heat the tube fairly evenly, and maybe you rotate it by this thing. It's a whole entirely different technology than what you would expect, but he had picked it up in some of his work for Dumont Laboratories, and they used that for making his tubes. This is an oxyacetylene torch, and this is an oxyhydrogen torch. All of these were found in Phil's estate when he died. And these are also parts that were used in making radio tubes. And I don't know much about them, but it's clear that you feed gas into the end of these things with the handle, and then you light the flame on the right, and it would melt the glass in the tube. So here's a picture of Phil's tube making laboratory, and you can see all these deforest audions being cooked up there, and the tube blowing system, just an amazingly complex system. But he made a great deal of money by selling these things, and we really need to have a way of telling Phil Weingarten specials from the real thing. On the left, you see the blanks for the spherical audions, and on the right, you see the blank for the Fleming valves. And he had just boxes and boxes of bases, which he could add to his tubes, probably broke a bunch of light bulbs and got the bases out, and then he would glue them on the tubes, but I'm not sure about that. Here are some of the plates that he had for deforest spherical audions. Some of these were made for him, and some of these he made himself. Here are some of the internal wires. All of this was turned up when people went through his estate and sold parts of it. Some filament wire that was used. And here are what you call presses, where you take the wires and you heat up the glass and you press the wires, put pressure on the glass, which seals the wires in position. And tube makers call this a press. Here is a bunch of notes that Phil used for making these, and this was found by Jim and Felicia Cruiser, and it's in their collection. It sort of reminds Phil about the sizes of the parts in the tube. You can see the filament down in the bottom there. And here is a Phil Weingarten homemade audion. And it looks very, very good. And all of his tubes work. There was no question about that. When you look at it closely, it's not that different from a commercially made audion. And here's another one. And again, how do you tell the difference? We really need somebody to come along and identify the difference, maybe make a catalog or a bunch of pictures of the real thing and compare them for us, because we do need the ability to tell the real thing from fake. Again, in the AWA Bulletin, the Old Timers Bulletin, a number of articles were or notes were published. Fake tubes. Let's see, references made in the last OTB to beware of fake tubes. Pictured as such a tube owned by John Stokes, one familiar with authentic audions can immediately recognize, even from the photograph, that it's a fake. Note the very heavy filament and external connecting wire, a very crude counterfeit. it does look a little bit like that particular one is quite crude, but certainly the ones that we've been looking at are not quite that crude. In any event, numerous warnings were published by the AWA. Now, it is not unusual for people to make replica tubes. One of the best of all the tube replica makers is Dr. Rüdiger Walzer in Germany. And here are some of the tubes that he made, typically European radio tubes. But Dr. Walzer always labeled his tubes that they were replicas. And if you look at the press, again, the place where you press the glass to hold the wires in place here, he also stamped Replica on that. So you can tell it is a replica. No way to tell with Phil's work. Here's an interesting one. One of the AWA members in Holland, Dirk Roelhorst, got in touch with Phil, and Phil sold him a Marconi Fleming valve for $750. And Dirk was very happy to get this tube. And it was only after he heard about my talk on Phil Weingarten that he became worried, because he had bought this from Phil Weingarten. He was worried that maybe he ended up with a fake. And here is a letter from Tyne, essentially saying that the Fleming valve is a very, very important, historically important tube. And Dirk saw that and realized that he had a very valuable tube, but he also was worried that the tube might be a fake. And here it is. This is the Fleming valve, Marconi Wireless Telegraph Company. And as you can imagine, this turned out to be a fake. And this is indeed one of Phil's fakes. So Dirk had essentially spent $750 on this fake tube. And he got in touch with me, and I said, oh dear, I think it is a fake. And so he decided, I said, why don't you come over to the AWA conference and show it to people, because people should see what Phil's work is like. And Dirk brought this over to the AWA conference to show people. And there he is with a big smile on his face, because I suggested that he put it in the auction when he brought it over to AWA. And so people all saw this fake tube, and then Dirk put it in the auction, and he had paid $750 for it, and it sold for $2,500 in the auction. So he couldn't believe that, but it was great. And very, very interesting that Phil Weingarten's fakes would be selling for more than he was selling them when he was alive, after he died. And I guess that's fairly common, that after an artist dies, sometimes their works increase in value. But in this case, Dirk was very happy about it. We end up with a picture of some of Phil Weingarten's stuff being sold at a flea market. And the guy in the back, sort of under the car window there, was one of the people who went to Phil's house and just bought out all the stuff that was there. Phil's daughter sold it all off for junk prices. And so it started showing up at the flea market. So the problem that we're left with is that there's a great large number of Phil Weingarten fake radios, fake telegraph keys, fake tubes out there. And it's very difficult, if not impossible, for most people to tell the difference. So that's my story, and I hope you enjoyed hearing about Phil's, and I'd be delighted with any comments and anything you have to say. Robert, let me just turn it over to you for a moment and ask whether that radio is a known radio, or whether Phil Weingarten might have made it the Lutz.
I don't know. Most of Phil's items are were above my pay grade. So I didn't get too involved with discussions about that because I was never going to be in the market for it.
Mm.
And I'm from the South. We don't have much money down here.
Thank you, Robert.
Well, thank you, Tom, for that excellent presentation. That was fascinating and so much history in that presentation. You presented it with such a great style that I really enjoyed it. So thank you very
Thank
much.
you. Thank you.
I have a question. This is Rudy. Do any of these tubes work?
Oh, yes, they all work beautifully. Absolutely.
Like, I guess they can't be too sorry if as long as they worked.
I
So
would
no-
just like to
no-
comment that AWA Volume 21 has a wonderful article by Tom in it on this topic. So
Mm.
any of you AWA members, or if you're looking for good reference.
Dayle,
had a
maybe
question.
you want to show that the radio that you have that you're wondering if it was a fake.
Yeah, this is a radio that I got from the widow of a friend from the club, and it's looks like a Wallace, and I open it up, there is no nameplate, no tag on it. So the interior of the box is unfinished. The only writing on it is on the back side where it says tuner. And then the other writing is on the tube itself where it has a printed label on it or etched label that says Wallace Audion detector in black ink. It's not clear etching, but it's in black. And the parts and the pieces look pretty much like the images I've seen of the Wallace detectors, but I can't tell, and so
Yeah, I guess the top lid not having holes for a name tag up there would send up red flags for me.
yeah.
Yeah, I would worry about it too. If you're seriously wondering, you might contact Jim Cruiser at AWA. He seems to be sort of the judge of these things, and he will certainly give you an opinion, a very well-educated opinion about it.
Okay. I'll send him pictures, and I thank you for the suggestion.
Yeah, please come back to us and let us know how it turns out, because I think we all need to know more about these radios.
Okay. Thank you, Tom and Robert.
Yeah, any other questions for Tom Perera?
I had one, if I may.
Yeah.
There were so many images, Tom, of the counterfeiting effort. I wondered if those were unearthed or if there was just so much legitimate work going on in those facilities that they were able to take, images, take pictures and stuff like that and freely.
Well, I think that there were sort of family pictures that Phil had taken probably of himself in the glass blowing factory that he had there. And he legitimized his activities. So he could always say, these are not counterfeiting activities, these are repair activities, because his card, for instance, would say radio tube repair. And he literally could repair radio tubes. And so those were pictures of him repairing original radio tubes. That's how I think he would respond to that. No counterfeiting pictures in there. They were all legitimate repair work.
I heard in discussions of Lowe, multifunction tubes made in Germany that that they had a program where Lowe would rebuild the tubes when the filaments went out.
Mm,
But I've also read that when
I can get
the
out of there.
German collectors tried to do the same thing in the 70s and 80s, that they had problems with doing a repair that far out. And they said that you couldn't work with glass that old. And so it's interesting to note that what the Germans reported in 20, 30 years ago.
that's fascinating. I guess they're implying that the structure of the glass changes over time, which is certainly reasonable, and they certainly have to open that glass and seal it back up if they're going to repair a tube.
I have a thing for, as these fakes got out in the open market over time, as people passed away, they could be sold as originals, even though
Yes.
they're fake. That would be the big issue, I think.
I think that's what's happening. Most people buy these things on the open market. They think that they're legitimate. They don't even never heard of Phil Weingarten. So little by little, people are going to forget Phil Weingarten, but going to remember DeForest. And oh boy,
Yeah.
I got a DeForest.
Right.
Phil Weingarten's indiscretions will be forgotten over time.
Yeah.
I just had one comment. I sat down just as he was showing the photo of the Signal Corps classroom. And there were a lot of guys. Well, my grandfather was Signal Corps World War I, a radio op. And I said, I wish I knew what he looked like and whether or not he could have been sitting in that particular group. I do have photos that he snuck when he was over in Germany during the war, probably not supposed to have done it, and show him sitting at his radio setup with the mill in front of him and the headphones on. And he was a character, but yeah, my grandfather was World War I Signal Corps.
That sounds great. Ed, can you show us a picture of the radio equipment that he was using?
Yeah, I can dig out that photo maybe for another showing. I don't have it right
that would be
at
great.
hand.
Yeah, do that for a future virtual forum. Get
Yeah,
some
because
time
I
to
had
prepare
it
it.
in a little display at RadioFest several years ago, along with his compass and some of the photos. And yeah, I can find that again.
Yeah,
Great.
that'd be a great for the virtual forum, and then it'll be on our YouTube channel.
Yeah, I actually used that photo for my ID on the NIDXA Skype chat room. I'm using the photo of my grandfather in World War I.
Last call for questions for Tom. If not, I'll thank Tom again for the wonderful presentation, and we look forward to many more if that's possible. And with that, I'll turn it over to Robert Lozier, who has done many presentations for the virtual forum and continues to amaze us with his technique restoration. And today he's got some special techniques that he uses in his restoration. So, Robert?
Letter in praise of UV Cure resins for vintage electronic repairs. Updated presentation of possible uses. You can saturate sheer polyester or heavier fiberglass cloth with CA adhesives and achieve a strong bond, but the bond is brittle. UV Cure urethane adhesive is much less brittle, so if you can get light into your bond area, it's a better choice. UV Cure resins and glues produce cross-linked molecular chains that generally will not be dissolved by any safe room temperature solvent commonly available. So presume that there is no going back with your repair unless you are going to break, cut, or sand it off. The UV light does not penetrate very far, just a fraction of a millimeter, through anything that is not transparent. Don't delay. Have a pair of UV safety glasses available to put on at all times that you have the light on. Just $8 to $20 on eBay or Amazon. There's a new compact lamp for you to consider using. It is powered from any phone charger with a USB-C cord. The UV glue I first found is this somewhat sketchy branded 50 milliliter bottle of LOC TTLF 3018. On last check, this seems to be missing on eBay. It is shown on Amazon by a seller, but with no history. But there are multiple listings by other vendors. Keywords to look for are crystal clear and casting, meaning low viscosity, so it will soak into fiberglass or polyester cloth and present less problems with air bubbles. Hard, meaning glossy, but not as brittle as regular CA adhesive. Upgraded, meaning lower odor and shrinkage if used for casting, and less oily film on the cured surface. Solar cure, meaning more sensitive to the UV. Clean uncured resin with acetone or even alcohol. Work time under shop lights is measured in hours, but under the UV light source, it is hardening in just seconds. Proof that you need to lightly sand surfaces of any thermoset or thermoform plastic, like this Catlin casting, before gluing. Be sure to wipe afterwards with alcohol pad. Here I have laid 2 strips of 6-ounce tightly woven fiberglass sheet popular with folks building RC model aircraft. The left strip is resting on an area that has been cleaned with alcohol but not sanded. The UV cure resin is low viscosity, about like pancake syrup, and will flood the cloth with little trouble. You can lay a piece of saran wrap or PET film over the saturated cloth and use your finger or bristle brush to work out bubbles and squeegee away excess resin. You can keep the film in place or lift it off now. Apply the UV light for 20 seconds or so at close range. As you can see here, the resin flows into the glass fibers and results in a near transparent band. At left, I grasp a sheet tab with my fingers and pull upwards. On this unsanded area, the tab peels away with about as much effort as to peel a strip of well-adhered heavy-duty packing tape. But on the right side test strip, I need to grip it with pliers in order to pull up on the tab. It bonds so well that the fiberglass actually tears before I can remove the entire strip. I say that the resin has a death grip on the Catlin that will never fail across a crack. You can add more layers of cloth to make the area more rigid. Just sand lightly and clean with alcohol before adding the next layer. How to separate glued and nailed joints. This front cabinet panel has shrunk in width enough to crack and show gaps at the bottom. The panel is nailed to the top and sides of the cabinet with strange funnel head nails that are impossible to extract by the head. A safe way to extract at a seam is to drive single-edge razor blades into a joint. You then drive in a second blade. Now you can widen the gap by driving a thicker box cutter blade between the 2 single-edge blades. The single-edge blades protect the sharp edges of the wood. I have a length of tempered steel about a 1/16 of an inch thick that can be used as a pry bar to expand the gap. To protect the wood while cutting through nails, bend shields of thin steel and notch is shown to protect against a hacksaw blade. Using that pry bar in the previous slide, I can drive in razor and box cutter blades to open gaps inside of cabinets. On the inside of split panels, make sure that there is no remaining finish coating like shellac, varnish, or lacquer. Lightly sand the surface and dust off. Make sure that any traces of solvents in the wood have had time to evaporate. Use whatever clamps are necessary to close the joint. As a precaution, I lay a strip of painter's tape across the good side of the panel to prevent wicking of resin. Lay a strip of fiberglass cloth across the crack and saturate with the UV resin. As you can see, it goes almost transparent. Apply the UV light. Should you want to apply additional layers, wipe thoroughly with alcohol and buff lightly before applying more resin and another layer of fiberglass. Number 1. This wood shrank a lot. I was able to glue in a filler strip of poplar that hides under molding that frames the panel. Done this way, I preserve the original finish of the panel that is exposed along the top of the cabinet. Number 2, this wood panel shrank enough to lock this very brittle hard rubber molding in place. I have a spool of 70 to 80 pound test braided Kevlar cord, only about 1/2 millimeter in diameter. You can pull the cord into a very small gap and pull tightly to wrap. Each layer added to the wrap exerts a hot spot free great force around to extract the flange. Here is a rare high-efficiency pen driver speaker circa 1935. The cone is very thin and extremely brittle. The embossed ridges on the cone make patches difficult to conform to. It seems if the British and Germans brought pen driver speaker design to the high state in the 1930s. This is apparently a U.S. version. I am amazed at how rigid the pivoting of this relatively massive armature is. The armature rocks on square brass rod staked through the center hole of the armature and staked to standoffs at each end. It is apparently not designed to rotate on this square brass rod. Therefore, the rod is being twisted just a tiny fraction of a degree at the gaps between the armature and the standoff, just about 1/8 inch. Remarkable to be rotating such a massive armature back and forth without benefit of a conventional axle rod. Here is a great application for UV cure resin. How to close tears when the back of the cone is not accessible. A dot of UV glue will bond a polyester and cotton thread to the cone. Anchor the other end to the frame. By crossing 2 threads like this, you can pull the tear together. Using very sharp, flush-cut pliers, nip the threads off when you are done. If you can access the backside, just use plain Scotch tape to hold the paper together. It is very easy to remove with just a few drops of acetone after repairs. The cured resin or paper is not damaged at all by the solvent. Now my secret weapon, Pelon number 865F interfacing, available at any fabric shop, even at big Walmarts. This very sheer polyester fabric material conforms like no other. It must be cut on the bias, 45 degrees to the warp and the weft, for maximum conformability. The easiest way to cut strips is to place on a plastic cutting mat and slice strips using a wicked sharp razor blade as you apply firm pressure with a steel rule. UV resin floods fabric and wets the paper cone. Easy to use a brush and tweezers to guide into place. You have plenty of time to work out bubbles. In 5 seconds, the resin will begin to harden. Maintain light on for 1 or 2 minutes. The white areas you see here are lost bits of the cone. It is amazing to me that the apex of the cone moves back and forth maybe only plus or minus 0.02 of an inch. So here is a worst case damage repaired to good working condition. Sprayed with flat black paint to prevent repairs from showing through even a sheer grill cloth. You can make authentic looking miniature tubing. Craft stores have 1 millimeter diameter braided cord for bead and jewelry making. It comes in various colors including black and brown. Pull out the 2 filler strands to yield a hollow length of braided cord. Acquire several feet of 30-pound test monofilament fishing line. Stretch it by dipping it in boiling water and twist to form a tight loop that you can push over the braid and out the other end. Saturate the braid with UV resin and irradiate. Clamp one end of the monofilament line in a vise and then pull on the braid to force it to slip along the line. Wipe the braid with an alcohol pad. Saturate the braid again and irradiate. Wipe again with the alcohol pad and you should be able to slide the length of tubing off the monofilament line. It fits perfectly over 26 gauge magnet wire. Fiber shoulder washers are getting hard to find locally. You can get number 8 fiber shoulder washers from DigiKey. 25 will cost you about $5 plus shipping and a 6 to 8 day wait. I will not be defeated. Number 8 flat fiber washers are still in my local hardware store. Use that 70 to 80 pound test braided Kevlar cord knotted around the screw as shown. Saturate with UV cure resin and irradiate. In this particular case, the stud isolation should be much greater than 500 volts. A bad design. Voice coil on a Bakelite bobbin only as thick as an eggshell, about 15 thousandths of an inch. Crazy for molding technology of the day. The voice coil is 4 layers of number 36 wire, 220 turns total, and there is a microscopic crack in the wire. The Thorophone driver repair with UV glue. Cracks in the Bakelite cone reinforced with expansion rings made of UV glue saturated Kevlar cord. This is made by wrapping plastic film around a wood dowel, then wrapping a helix of cord and saturating with resin. The oversized helix rings stay in place until more glue is applied. Sheer bias cut polyester fabric wrapped around the cone and saturated with UV glue. Not pretty, but it works. This seems to be the only other company besides Magnavox to make a moving coil horn driver before late 1929. I think the Magnavox is still capable of more sound power, but the mica diaphragm of the Thorophone unit may present a more mellow tone. These audio transformers are both open circuit, but original to the design of the Harkness Counterflex, circa 1924-25. I have made several batches of a solid-state transformer emulator for audio amplifier circuits of that vintage radio. I have never tested the device in a radio using the reflex circuit where one vacuum tube is configured to amplify both at radio frequency and at audio frequency. The happy answer is yes, it will work. There is just enough clearance between the tube socket contacts and the bottom of the transformer to park the little circuit board with a little square of double-stick carpet tape. I use miniature tubing to conceal the wiring to the transformer terminals. A little rectangle of black paper makes this board virtually invisible. The set works, and the original transformers remain in place, and in this case, all the wiring is still in place. Make a tube holder fixture for bass repair. I find that vacuum tubes from the 1920s, especially the early 1920s, will have pin solder connections that can undergo tremendous oxidation. Time to get out the solder sucker and extract what is there and resolder. But that is likely a three-handed affair. Better to make this simple holder to securely grip the tube bulb. Cut 3 5-inch squares of 3/4 inch MDF board. Cut a hole in the center of 2 squares and glue together. Then slice in half. Cut a bevel about 15 degrees off each side as shown, and line the holes with soft foam rubber. Attach each half of the bottom square with 1 screw as shown. An extension spring with a pull string tied to one eye keeps the fixture closed. Use a fiberglass scratch brush on the pins before any attempt to desolder. You may find that the solder has completely oxidized around the tube wire and is now a powder. Clean as much of it away as you can. Add plenty of flux, and a large soldering iron will prepare for rapid vacuum solder removal. The tube wire will likely be stuck to the inside wall of the pin. Break it loose with an X-Acto blade. Form a tiny hairpin of 30 gauge wire to push between the tube wire and the inside wall. This will allow you to slip a small helix of 30 gauge wire over the lead. Apply more flux and solder. That helix will cause the solder to wick much farther down into the pin. I've been able to salvage maybe 20% of my early tubes this way. A McMichaels receiver had heavily corroded nickel-plated hardware. It was cleaned in my 30-year-old ultrasonic cleaner. Parts polished and then replated in my newly constructed miniature plating barrel. It is easy to make. I can provide instructions if you like. 2 batches of parts in the barrel required less than 2 hours to process. Take most of the warp out of a solid plank. Note, this applies to boards stripped of any finish like shellac, varnish, or lacquer. The lid was grimy with embedded coal dust and what I feared was black mold. I cleaned it with Gojo. The lid was solvent stripped of all finish. I thought about washing with chlorine bleach, but I forgot. But I've done that in the past. Laid out a large trash bag on a sturdy, flat surface. I moistened a cotton dish towel thoroughly, but no dripping. Rolled the towel out flat in the bag. Sprinkled mold and mildew fumigate on the towel. The brand name is Sunpack Mildewcide. Cover with a sheet of plastic canvas to prevent water from wicking upwards. This plastic canvas is available at craft stores. Lay the warped panel on the canvas. Lay another sheet of plastic canvas on the top of the panel. Moisten another cotton towel thoroughly, but no dripping. Roll the towel out flat over the canvas. Close the bag. Don't rush this task. The mildew side is essential. Fungus spores can take off anytime the moisture and temperature are high enough. It's going to take up to 10 to 20 days to get the wood ready for sanding, staining, and applying layers of finish. Lay a heavy slab of scrap stone countertop material on top and clamp the stack as tight as you can. I left this stack clamped for 4 days. The half-inch thick panel appeared to have been flattened completely. I then began to dry the board. I replaced the wet towels with dry towels, left the ends of the bag open, but clamped the stack back tight. I repeated the process 2 more days. I replaced the towels with 3 strips of 1x2 lumber on both sides to enable better drying. I let the board dry for an additional week before refinishing. 2/3 to 3/4 of the warp is now gone and is not noticeable. While restoring the warped panel just mentioned, I discovered an Easter egg hidden on New Year's Eve of 1928, built into the base pan of the power supply for a McMichaels AC Demic 3 all-wave receiver by G.B. Tabor, Stoke Gardens, Slough, Bucks, England. And it says, "With the Doughboys in the Great War. Best of luck, boys." Mr. Tabor lived only 2 blocks from the McMichaels factory. It appears this receiver was a special order from an American radio enthusiast looking for a mains-powered all-wave radio at a time when virtually none were being made in the USA. Who was this G.B. Tabor? The only mention I found of him comes from a 1931 local newspaper article reporting that a person had been brought to court charged with threatening to kill Mr. Tabor. Well, that's all I have for today. And I just say that if you're into fixing radios, that you really ought to have some of the UV cure glue in your toolbox. I've used it many times since I discovered it maybe about a year ago.
Well, that's great, Robert. I know your presentation a while back, you talked a little bit about it, and this update sure looks like it's a winner. Does anybody have any questions for Robert?
I've got one for you, Robert. You briefly showed the little surface mount board that you use to replicate a transformer.
Yeah.
Can you briefly describe what that circuit is?
Well, it's a Darlington amplifier. I didn't actually design it. A guy in Texas designed it, and but he used discrete components. And I said, well, I've spent 9 years of my life doing circuit board layouts for surface mount stuff. And I said, well, I could make that a whole lot smaller. And so I got the guy in Texas. He was happy to see me make a surface mount version of it, and something that was really easy to hide. And the main point of the whole exercise is that I do not want to get rid of the original components because of their historical importance. But I know it's fun to get radios working, so this we know that you can use RC coupling a lot of times to do that task, but you lose the voltage gain of the transformer. So this thing can be, the little board can be set for, say, a 3.5 to 1 ratio or 5 to 1 ratio, just by changing 2 resistors in it. So it's right now there's probably 60 of those boards that have been put into various 20s vintage radios, and none of them have failed to work so far. But that was the reason for doing that. I don't really advertise them, but if you send me an email, I will. I'll show you how to acquire a couple of them. They're $15 a piece, unless the post office changes their shipping rates again.
Terrific. So it's a way to get that radio to work with an open transformer and retain the original parts. That's great.
Yeah, I use in one of my presentations, I showed a 20 set that I've on the transformer. They've got 2 kludged stand core transformers with all their vinyl insulated wires spread out from them, and not really fitting into the available space, and that just destroys the radio for me. So that's my motivation.
Robert, I have a question, Robert, on you said that you have information on the plating device that you made.
Yeah, I'll put in the comments section here in the chat, and my email address, and you can send me an email on that. I'll be glad to respond.
Thank you.
Dayle, you can also check our YouTube index. Robert did a previous presentation on this. And so there's full details on that.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, that was a most excellent presentation, Robert. I'm always astounded by the things you come up with, and I'm very inspired to go off and try some of those techniques in the future.
If I could just jump in, Tom, real quick, I got a question for Robert. When you had the fiber washer on the screw, why did you need to use the UV cured glue on that?
Well, the thing is that locally I couldn't get a shoulder washer that I needed to provide insulation on that.
So you put the string around it, and you put it on the string to make a shoulder. Got it.
Yeah, and it works good if you have your UV glue and the Kevlar fishing line, which I had in my toolbox.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a quick question. This is Keith.
Go ahead.
On the headphones, you named a cloth that you use to imitate the cloth covering of the headphones. Excuse me. What was the name of that? And I believe you said you got that at Hobby Lobby. Is that correct?
No. The cloth that I use in repairing is it's used in making clothing, and it's a liner material for clothing, and it's available at any craft shop, or cloth shop.
Yep.
Or
yeah, Joanne Fabrics or whatever.
Yeah, and if I don't have that screen up now, but it's a commonly available material. and I think they'll post this video in the next month or so, so you can go back in and see whatever that material is.
Was that the
Yeah, I
stuff
just have
that, I'm sorry, was that the Pelon
Yeah.
number 865F interfacing?
Yeah.
Okay, I was taking notes during the presentation, that's why.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Robert, thanks again for the presentation. If there's no further questions, we'll wrap up the presentation section. And at this time, I'll make my pitch again. Please try and find it in your hearts to be a presenter. So at this point, we will do the show and tell. And so if you have one, now's the time. Step forward, please.
I've got one, Tom.
Okay, Dale, let's hear it.
Yeah. Some of you I saw at the Wisconsin meet on, I guess that was March 3rd. I came home with a fairly early tube. This is one of the brass base Shaw type tubes from the Morehead labs. It's got ER etching on it with a serial number. And it's also got the MD stamp, the Marconi and DeForest stamping on the base. So I hadn't seen one of those available for a while. And that surprised me. And the same guy also had this tube, which is another Morehead, early one with it's an ER, electron relay, early with the aluminum pieces bent into the press. That does not have the MD base. It's a Shaw base. Again, that's about 1920. And then the real surprise was a golden VT, which is the VT etching on it with the serial number etching on it. No MD on it, but it's a nice base and it's got the golden tint to it. So I was a pretty happy camper coming home. Did not expect that at the local swap meet. So.
Hopefully it's not a Phil special.
Hey, Dave. Educate market value of those sort of things are, or at least if you can share that with us.
The value varies, but they're, circa 1920. The Morehead is the one that has the Morehead etching on it is the earliest from what I can read in the reference books. I saw some at the ARCI auction back about 2018, and I think they started the bidding at $50 to $75, something like that. So,
well, the question is always, is the filament
yeah,
good?
Yeah, and I don't know yet. I was pleased to get them,
and if the filaments are good, are you going to put it into a radio or make a project out of it, or is it just going to be a shelf clean?
It's for display right now.
Well, that's great, Dale. That's cool stuff, and appreciate you sharing that with us.
And there's really good information in volume 27 of the AWA review. Eric Weines has a real good description in there. So, and the other thing from the swap meet was I got the author of the lead article in AWA 36 to sign his article for me. This is on the the front and back cover. He had the lead article, and this is all about the Central Lab story. It's part 3 of that story. So you never know what you find at a local meet.
That's cool. Thanks, Dale. Any other show and tells this morning? Okay, well, if not, I will turn it over to Tom Kleinschmidt, who will tell us about the upcoming swap meet in April and RadioFest. Tom?
Okie dokie, let me do a quick share here. Most of you are familiar with RadioFest. It's been going on for decades, obviously evolved with time. We have a few new things this year, which is really what I want to focus on. But I'll just give you the overview. There's a lot of detail in here that I'll go into if somebody has questions, but I'm not going to bore you with every little nauseous detail. So here we go. First off, everything that's in here will be in multiple places. The almost all of it, as you not necessarily the way you see it, but is going to be in the ARCI newsletter. It's going to be published in April. The ARCI website will have this stuff. Of course, you know, you get email blasts from me, and that'll be there. And the online registration also has it. And I'm not sure how many people are familiar with the online registration. We've been doing that for a couple of years now. And if it comes up. So anyway, this is the home screen. There was a clickable thing here that's not here. So I can't go there. I guess it's not because it's not live yet. And but anyway, all that information is under this where it says click below. And the registration page looks like this. And we have indoor selling along with outdoor selling this year. I'll spend most of the time talking about that. So that's the registration page. And as I said, it'll go live April 1st. And the reason for April 1st is we're still working out a couple of details, but not to worry. So I'll go back to sharing the PowerPoint. So we'll talk about the venue and the timing, what's going to happen during this year's event, the pricing, the seminars, and that'll cover it. So again, Shriner's facility, as you know it, the new thing here is right here where it says indoor seller space. It'll be in the same room as we have the auction on Friday night. It'll be in addition to the outdoor seller spaces. There isn't enough room to move everybody inside, and not everybody wants to be inside. But for those of you who've been here the last 2 years, weather has not been our friend. 2 years ago, it was a zillion degrees out there, and last year it rained the entire time. Other than that, it was great. So like I said, these addresses and so on will all be in all the published data. So just to quickly go through the schedule, online registration we talked about. The hotel discount is open now. There's a link, not on the website yet, but there's a link in here. Again, that'll all get published. Mail-in registration will still be the same. And we'll be able to on-site register and check in on Friday. The auction will be Friday night. All pretty much the same stuff as we've had before. So if you're used to going to RadioFest, the basic building blocks are all the same. Swap meet on Saturday, check in the morning if you need to, seminars and the banquet. We've changed the pricing scheme a bit. It doesn't make any difference whether you go online or mail in. The pricing will all be the same, and you get a discount for pre-registering. You can still rent tables outside if you need tables and you don't bring your own. The big deal, of course, here is the indoor. And I'll show you a layout in a little bit. But we have 6 foot and 8 foot tables because that's what the Shriners have, and it's roughly 50-50 between the two of them. And you get a table and a chair when you sign up for a spot on the indoor side. So next thing, banquet. I see it. I did fine. Sorry, I'm kind of clunky today. Sorry about that, gang. We are committing to all of the meals this year, meaning we have to sell 75 meals. Normally we sell about 40 on a pre-registration basis, and we're looking to allow people to register on site or at the door if tickets are still available. Because a lot of people came to me and said, well, I didn't think about it when I pre-registered, but I'd really like to do it now. And by that time, we were always locked in with the venue. So we're going to pay for them and hopefully use them. Otherwise, we'll have another loss leader here, but I don't expect to. Everybody enjoys the camaraderie. We have a good meal and it's convenient. It's right next door to where the auction is in the indoor swap meet. Hotel. Short version is it went up $10 this year. It was 109 last year. It's 119 this year. There is a website where you can log in to register, or you can call the Hilton phone number. And as you know, you can walk right across the parking lot and you're in the right place. So seminars, we got 3 planned this year. Larry Stark is going to talk about his life in amateur radio as part of the Bill Ross and Bob Drake Memorial Forum. Pete Nacita, who's there every year doing something, and everybody enjoys it. He's going to talk about radio collecting, just the basics of doing it. And Bob Lang, who many of you don't know probably, but he's been a member for a few years. He's going to talk about powering up and protecting radio power supplies. This would be in like 30s radios, so fusing and so on. And he'll be talking about that. We will be posting the times for those. We don't have that at this point, but they'll be obviously during the day on Saturday. So, as we mentioned, on the site and at the door, tickets for banquets. Indoor food service is going to be only indoor food service instead of outdoors, so it'll be co-located with the indoor spot meet in the same area where we have food service for the auction. And I think we talked about most of this. Specifically, there's 23 6-foot tables and 24 8-foot tables. And the 4 round tables you're used to having for the auction, where you can eat and watch the auction, they're going to remain, so you guys can eat and meet in the indoor venue whenever you want. So here's the layout. Obviously, where all these blue tables are is where the seating is right now. This is going to be reconfigured because obviously those tables are back to back for the auction. And this room over here is where the banquet and seminars are. So we usually have it where you walk around the corner to get in. So this is that corridor that goes off in the side. And that pretty well covers it.
I think it's exciting that we've got indoor selling. I think there's a lot of people that, because of the weather, they just don't want to come to the RadioFest because the heat and the potential for storms and all that. So I think this will be a good opportunity for more people to show up and maybe bring some stuff that they're not worried about getting the weather on. They can bring that indoors, and I think it'll be good.
Yeah, I think people hold off on some of their higher quality stuff because they don't want to have it exposed to the weather, even if it's in the back of their vehicle. So this way it's fully protected, and it's air conditioned, of course, too, which doesn't hurt. And a number of people have said that dealing with the parking lot is not something they can do anymore physically. Some of our members that have issues with walking, so they prefer to be inside. And so I'm thinking it's going to be a real good thing all around.
Yeah, that's great. So I will say thank you to the presenters today for the excellent presentations and all the other contributors with the show and tells and discussion, and Tom for talking about the RadioFest. So hope to see you in May, and so thank you very much.